Welcome back to the history of video games, part 7. Today we'll finish off on the 5th console generation. We'll see the beginnings of Sega's downfall, and we'll see how Nintendo eventually lost its dominance in the video game industry. But of course, this generation starts again with Sega. Like we've talked about before, Sega was already developing its next generation console in the early 90s when the Super Nintendo was coming in to challenge it. 32X, which I didn't mention when we were talking about the Mega Drive, was originally conceived to be its own standalone system. Sega had been planning to make the Saturn its own much more developed system. 32X, originally titled Sega Mars, was intended to be a sort of in-between system between the Mega Drive and the Saturn, but because Sega wanted to focus its efforts on a completely new system, they eventually just turned it into an add-on for the Mega Drive and then just focused on finishing up the Saturn. Now, as mentioned before, even though the Super Nintendo and the Mega Drive were competing on pretty much equal ground in North America and in Europe, there was one market area that Sega had never been particularly popular at, and that was Japan. Of course, we've talked about this before. When the Famicom came out, it completely overshadowed the SG-1000. And even when the Mega Drive hit, which was really Sega's first super popular video game system, it was even then eclipsed in its home market by NEC's PC Engine. So Sega was determined that it was going to get the best possible start for Saturn, and it was going to start on its home turf in Japan. So the Sega Saturn, which looked like this in Japan, was really given the full weight of Sega's marketing campaign. There were loads of television advertisements and things like that. They even had a Sega Saturn on Neon Genesis Evangelion, which, although I've mentioned not a show I like, was a big anime at the time. And all of it seemed to have paid off. Saturn really went off into sales success in Japan. But then later that year, another console arrived on the market, the Sony PlayStation. Well, I've mentioned the origins of the Sony PlayStation before, so I won't get into that. But I will tell you why it was kind of interesting that the Sony PlayStation arrived when it did. First of all, there was a lot of skepticism towards the PlayStation. Sony was not really thought of as a games company, and therefore many people believed that this flirt with the video game industry might have gone the same way as another one of Nintendo's bastard children. But what Sony effectively did was convince third-party support that it was a viable 3D system, which is why it got a very strong support already at the very early phases of its existence. And if we were to look at this from Sega's point of view, the thing that's become very evident from the Sega CD, the 32X, is that Sega really had a chip on its shoulder. Really, ever since the Mega Drive hit the market, Sega's single goal in life was to annihilate Nintendo. So the fact that there might be another potentially competent video game system out to challenge it, well, you can kind of see why Sega would flip the crazy switch. And unfortunately, nothing exemplifies this better than when the Sega Saturn arrived in North America. The 7th of September, of course, which also fell on a Saturday, was supposed to be the American release date of the Sega Saturn, or as Sega put it in their own cheesy fashion, Saturn Day. And Saturn Day, by the way, was already a much earlier date from the original planned release date. Then in the spring of 1995, we had the very first Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3. And E3 was where most people got their very first glimpses of the upcoming PlayStation and the upcoming Sega Saturn. And at the E3, Sega made a shocking surprise announcement. The Sega Saturn would be available immediately. Now you might think that the secret to a good surprise is that you don't tell anybody. Well, in the gaming industry, unfortunately, that's not quite how it works. The people who were seriously surprised about Sega's announcement were not just Sega's hardcore fans, they were also the retailers and the people who were actually making games for the Saturn. The American retailers, who had been led to believe that Saturn Day was going to be the official debut of the Sega Saturn, were now left with no choice but to throw out all the advertisements and all the other things that they had done in preparation for the arrival of the Saturn. Some retailers were so pissed off about this that they thought, you know what, Sega, fuck you. we're not gonna sell your system. The same was really true for the third-party developers who were planning to make games for the Sega Saturn. Now you have to understand the fact that the system was going to be out immediately without any sort of big plans for support titles or anything like that meant that the only products that were really available at the time were ones that Sega had made themselves. And to the third-party support, this seemed like Sega was just trying to hawk all the money to themselves. So a lot of these third-party supporters just said, you know, Sega, fuck you. We're not gonna make games for your system. And I would like to say that the final nail on the coffin was the fact that at that very same E3, the PlayStation, which was due to arrive for the holiday season of 1995, was announced a full $100 cheaper than the Sega Saturn. But that's not even where the failed train stops. Okay, so Sega had admittedly committed their biggest business mistake since handing over the advertising rights of the Master System to Tonka. But this generation was still at a very early phase. You'd think that they had time to correct their mistakes. Okay, so the Saturn didn't gain any serious headway by the time the PlayStation arrived, but it's not like all of the third-party support just flat out disappeared or anything like that. I mean, the Saturn was huge in Japan. What about all those Japanese game companies that were making games for the Saturn? Well, in another effort to try to get a leg up on the PlayStation, Sega inevitably shot itself in the foot. Why are there so many metaphors related to guns and feet? For whatever reason, Sega of America's management was convinced that Americans were simply not attracted to the sort of games that were being released in Japan, and instead they put a kind of a block and a limit to the amount of games that were being brought over from Japan, and instead they tried very desperately to get American game developers to make games for the Saturn. It's worthy of mention though that this assumption wasn't based on anything rational. If you were a hardcore Sega fan, you just wanted games for the fucking system. You didn't care where they came from. And if it wasn't disappointing for Sega fanboys everywhere that a lot of these Japanese games on the Saturn were forever doomed to become Japanese exclusives, the fact that a majority of these American-developed games just, well, sucked was enough to ensure that the Saturn was never gonna catch up to the PlayStation. And if you think things were bad in North America, think about Europe. That's where Sega had previously achieved some pretty strong support. In Europe, the Saturn was practically invisible. So you can imagine that Nintendo didn't even have to try that hard when they finally did release their own next-generation console. Yes, finally in 1996 in Japan, the Nintendo 64 was released, and the rest of the world finally got it in 1997. And yes, it can carry those two numbers in its name with pride because it is, and always will be, the only 64-bit system on the market. And the Nintendo 64 got off to a really good start. Right off the bat, Super Mario 64 was extremely well received. The N64 was also the first console to come standard with an analog control stick. The Star Fox 64, of course, gave us the rumble feature. And yes, just because you're first doesn't make you the best. Point is, the PlayStation did adopt these technologies, and they would then become, of course, industry standards. And of course, 1998, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. But unfortunately, the Nintendo 64 didn't manage to catch up to the PlayStation. What was the main reason? It really comes down to only one thing: the ratio of games released for these systems. And that ratio was severely slanted in the PlayStation's favor. Now, the popular image that people have is that there was a massive migration of third-party support of companies to the PlayStation. And while that might have been the case, I'd rather argue that the case came actually down to something much more simpler, and that was the media, which the PlayStation and the N64 used. The PlayStation, like most of the consoles in this generation, used CD-ROMs as its game media, whereas Nintendo, who had kind of fucked up their chances of getting a viable CD-ROM publisher for their system, decided that it was just going to stick with regular old game cartridges, which inevitably did mean that game production was a bit more costly for the N64 than the PlayStation. And it perhaps didn't help Nintendo that they were this late into the generation. They thought because they did so good on the Super Nintendo, then they wouldn't really have to try as hard. But Nintendo was also the victim of some bad luck and ill-advised statements. Okay, we can't really blame Capcom and Konami for starting to develop games for the PlayStation, and the fact that certain games by those companies became massive critical successes, of course, did mean that the PlayStation all of a sudden became a very, very lucrative platform for other developers as well. And one company that Nintendo definitely did wrong in this generation was Square. Square, who had developed 6 of their Final Fantasy games on Nintendo systems, was contemplating about the possibility of maybe continuing on the N64 front. But an unfortunate statement by Nintendo meant that they were gonna just go over to PlayStation side. What Nintendo basically said was Square's games were boring and nobody outside Japan wanted to play them. And of course, they then went and released Final Fantasy VII. Oops. But I have to stress, because this whole third-party support thing is such a big thing when talking about the Nintendo 64, there was some genuine third-party support. Like I mentioned before, Nintendo and Rare were really like best buds at this point, because Rare had developed Donkey Kong Country games like Killer Instinct, and they would go on to make up several more critically acclaimed and high-selling games for the N64. Another company that really warmed up to Nintendo, surprisingly enough, was Midway. Yes, the people that made Mortal Kombat. Which ensured, for better or for worse, that a lot of Midway's arcade titles found their way to the N64. By the way, we will talk a little bit more about the arcades in the next video. But yes, none of this changes the fact that the N64 was at a massive disadvantage against the PlayStation, and as a result, the PlayStation became the best-selling system of its generation, on some very notable credentials, I have to say. A company with no video gaming history whatsoever, developing a high-end product and winning over the support of the gaming industry. At the same time, I hate the people that always say that N64 marked the fall of Nintendo. First of all, the Nintendo 64 didn't only outsell the Super Nintendo, but also the GameCube, which, I'll admit, kinda looks bad for Nintendo's future. And you have to remember that Nintendo was and still is dominating the handheld gaming industry. And late 90s? Pokemon? Does any of that ring a bell? Nintendo was swimming in dough from all the Pokemon merchandise and things, what have you. But yes, Nintendo did lose its dominant position in the industry because of their overt self-assuredness, which is a lesson Nintendo did learn from, as we will see in the following video. But I say all of these things in defense of the N64 just to point out that Nintendo was never in any massive financial peril, unlike... Now, when we talk about Sega in part 5 of the history of video games, it seemed like they had built themselves into a very respectable and powerful video game company, which they were. Sega and Nintendo are the only 2 companies in history that have supported no less than 3 consoles at the same time. But we can't forget that one of those systems was severely losing out to one of Nintendo's own systems, and the other one, although outwardly interesting, not a major sales success. The Mega Drive was Sega's really big hit. Okay, so maybe it wasn't that popular in Japan, but it was popular in North America and Europe. 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Unfortunately, the Saturn then was the complete opposite. It was really big in Japan, but not anywhere else. Which explains why we haven't heard of anything from NEC in a while. Its PC Engine system was super popular in Japan, but because the American release was so utterly fucked, NEC kinda ended up losing a lot of money, because you don't just release a console to a market area, have it fail, and then just go, oh well, we'll just do better in the next one. You pretty much have to establish yourself in those areas before you can really hope to go on. Which is why NEC decided that it was gonna just cut its losses and just stop after the PC Engine stopped being relevant. Sega unfortunately didn't have that privilege. It had a major console released in all 3 major territories and getting its ass kicked in 2 of them. And by this time, none of their other products were really bringing in any serious amounts of money. Which is to say that the Saturn dealt a very devastating blow to Sega financially. And unfortunately, as we will learn, Sega never quite recovered from it. My question for next time is more of an opinion poll. There's no right answer this time, but which of the 6th generation consoles had the most important innovation? See you on the next one. Woohoo!